Hi, I'm Tony from Humpop Gaming. Today we'll look at making a reusable debouncer. We'll start by looking at what a debouncer is and the problem it solves, then implement a basic one and finally make a small refactor to it so we can reuse it across multiple scripts. If you already know what a debouncer is, feel free to jump to the section that's relevant to you. I've added timestamps in the description below. A debouncer is one of those scripts that you'll find yourself writing over and over again. If you're here and you don't know what a debouncer is, just think of how your computer handles a key press. When you press a key, it sends a signal to type a letter. But if you hold down the key, your computer doesn't type a million letters instantly. It waits for a short time before repeating the key press. That short delay prevents accidental duplications from a single key press. Roblox are debouncers often used for interactions with buttons, switches, and other user input. So let's look at how to implement one. We'll start by adding a script. In my opinion, the easiest way to show debouncer working is by printing values to the console. So first we create the while loop which prints a value every time an iteration is completed. It does this by calling print time. I've added this function because we'll be adding the debounce functionality in here. Now this print time function then in turn calls the get formatted time function. And in here I'm using the OS clock. This returns the amount of CPU time that's being used in seconds by the current Lua environment. I then take the value and work out the hours, minutes, seconds and milliseconds. For the hours, I take the time divided by 3600, because that's how many seconds are in 1 hour. Then for the minutes, I take the time that's been elapsed, get the remaining number of seconds that's yet to be completed within this hour, divide it by 60, and that gives me the remaining minutes left. Then I do the same for seconds. For milliseconds, I have to calculate a fraction of the time that's been elapsed. I do this by getting the remainder of 1. This then gives everything after the decimal place. I then times it by 1000 and it gives me the milliseconds. They're all wrapped in a math.flow method which will guarantee the whole number is returned. I then add them to a string formatter and return the value. It's worth mentioning from the OS clock that you're going to notice as we go throughout the tutorial, the first outputted numbers will start getting higher and higher than earlier in the tutorial. That's because it doesn't reset to 0. The value that we see in the output is an accumulated CPU time used in this session. I'm not going to mention this function again in this tutorial, just know it's there and we'll be getting the outputted time for the rest of the debouncing session. So here I press F8, you can see that we're getting many values added to the console. If I stop this, and let's get rid of milliseconds for now. And play it. What we'll see is we're getting 30 values hit to the console every second. What this means is I've got a refresh rate of 30 frames per second. I'm going to add a debouncer in so that we only get one value added every second. I'm going to re-add the milliseconds. Reduce the size of my output. Maybe reduce the size of my script. Now, like with most things when you're writing code, there's more than one way to achieve what you're trying to achieve. So I'm going to show you a couple of different options before we move on to making the reusable debouncer. So option 1 is we can create a local variable up here and set it to false. Then what we can do, we can add a conditional statement saying if debouncer is true, then return. So for that to ever become true, we need to come down here and set the debouncer to true. Get rid of that line there. Then what we'll say here is we'll call task.wait, add 1 second, and actually put a dot in there, not a comma. And then after the script has waited for a second, it'll now execute the next line, which is debounce false. So what we'll see now is when we run the script, once every second, we're getting a new value printed to the console. Personally, I feel there's some unnecessary code here, so we can do it slightly differently. And this next option is my preference, but both of them work and both of them are absolutely fine. This comes down to a matter of preference. Let's look at this next option and you choose which you prefer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this to debouncer 1. I'm going to duplicate the script. Rename the duplicated script to debouncer 2, and I'm going to disable debouncer 1. So now I've got everything from that first script. I'm going to collapse the get formatted time function because we know what that's doing, it's not going to change. And I'm going to change the debounce, and I'm going to change the debounce variable to time last executed. And this is going to be OS clock. Now, in our if condition, we're going to say if, I'm going to type it right first, if OS clock minus the time last executed is less than or equal to 1, then we want to return, and we don't want anything else to happen. Otherwise, we're going to take the time last executed and reassign the OS clock value to it. I'm then going to get rid of that other code underneath because it's just not needed for this script. So what we're saying here is, whatever the time of the clock is at the moment, take away the last time that we executed this function, and if the difference between those is more than 1, then let's carry on what we're going to do. So here if I press F8, then we'll see every second we're getting a value printed to the console. So these are a couple of basic debouncers. But the problem with both of these options is that we need to copy and paste these scripts into different scripts in our code, and we just want a reusable solution. So let's create a module script for us to call, and we can put this code in there, and we can make it something that we can package up and reuse across multiple games. So first of all, I come to replicated storage, add a module script, and this time I'll call it a debouncer helper. Copy that, add that in here. And before we carry on, I'll just disable that last script. Actually, I'll duplicate it, and we'll be calling this call, I don't know, reusable debouncer. So first of all, we want to make ourselves a function in here. Try that again. Remove the dot debouncer helper dot handle debounce. Give that a capital because that's my convention, and I always try to stick to my conventions. Now, we're going to need to pass 3 items in here. One's a key, we want a delay, and we want an action. Try that again, an action, spelt correctly. So it'd be really nice if I could just copy and paste my code into here and have it work. But we need to make some slight adjustments because we're going to make this script reusable. But as we know the concept of what we're doing, there's not going to be that much to do. Remember, this script is going to be called by many other scripts, so we can't just return if the delay since the last call has not been exceeded. So I start by adding a table to help keep track of the execution times. First get the current time from OS clock, then set the time last executed variable, which is a value that's in the execution times table, and it's indexed by the key which we pass in. Now, if that value doesn't exist in there, I set a default value of 0. This means that the first time that this script is called by whichever script is calling it, it will always execute. Now we check this current time minus the time last executed, and if that's less than or equal to the delay that has been passed through, then we're going to return. We're not going to do anything else here. But if the delay has been exceeded, then we'll execute the rest of our script. So what we do here is update whatever's in the execution times table with the current time, and then we execute whatever custom code has been passed through by the calling script. So now we need to call this reusable debouncer. So let's enable the calling script. We can get rid of this time last executed variable because this is being handled by our module script now. We start by requiring the debouncer helper. Then we've got our formatted time functionality, which we saw earlier, and we've still got our while loop at the bottom. Next, I'm going to get rid of everything inside the print time functionality. I'm going to call my debouncer helper. I'm going to pass a key in. I'm going to call this part 1, and I'm going to ask it to update every half second, and I'll create a function up here, which is the function I want it to run every time it executes. So once again, we're just saying print get formatted time. So in here, I simply pass the printer function, make sure the other ones are disabled. When I run it, press F8. Now we're getting 2 values every second. As part of testing this, we'll want to call it more than just with one script. So what I'm going to do is call this a second time. And this time I'm going to pass in a different key. This time I'm going to call every 1 second. And I want to show you how you're going to handle a function that accepts a parameter. So we'll take a random number in here. And what we'll do is we'll get the formatted time. I'll need to change this. We'll call it printer2. So just passing in the name of function now is no longer enough. We also need to pass in a variable for that number. So in here, if I put in an anonymous function and I call printer2, I can pass the math.random functionality and get a random number between 1 and 100. So when the value with the key part 1 executes, it'll be executing every half second and it'll just be printing the formatted time. When the call with the key part 2 executes, it'll be executing every 0.1 of a second. It'll send out our formatted time and it'll put a random number on the end. So it's pretty hard to see. So if we stop that and come back up, we can see here that at 4106 and 4107, let's go up a little bit higher. 4106, then again at 4106. Now our next one is 4107. That's been called by our printer function. And then everything in between is called by this printer2 function. And that's everything from me. If you have any thoughts, drop them in the comments. I'm Tony from Humpop Gaming. I'll see you in the next one.